All right, welcome back for another deep dive.
Here we go.
And today we're going to be tackling something I think a lot of people deal with on a daily basis, but they might not know the ins and outs of. We're going to be talking about noise complaints, and specifically in the UK.
Ooh, yeah.
So we had a listener write in, and they want to know about when a council enforcement officer would choose to use the Noise Act, as opposed to Section 80 of the Environmental Protection Act 1990 to handle a noise issue. So that's what we're going to try to figure out today. Hopefully you can stick with us and we can make sense of it all.
Yeah, I mean, it is a pretty tricky question because it really gets into like the nitty-gritty of how environmental law actually works in the real world.
Right.
So, enforcement officers need to pick the right tool for the job, and that's what we're going to be looking at today. We're going to be thinking about some real-world scenarios and how these two pieces of legislation apply.
So how about we start by just laying the groundwork? Let's talk about the Environmental Protection Act of 1990, or EPA for short.
Sounds good.
Covers a lot of stuff. All right.
Yeah, it's massive. It's huge. EPA is kind of like this big overarching piece of legislation, and it covers all different types of pollution. So like air pollution, water pollution, land pollution, all sorts. And yeah, noise pollution definitely falls under that umbrella, particularly through Section 80, which deals with what are called statutory nuisances.
Okay, so that's where noise comes in. But then why do we even need a Noise Act if the EPA is already there? Why isn't everything just handled through the EPA?
Well, that's a great question, and it kind of gets to the heart of it.
Yeah.
So the EPA really is mostly concerned with preventing harm. So it's about regulating things like industrial processes to make sure that they operate within certain limits so that they're protecting the environment and protecting public health.
So I remember when we were looking at the EPA, we talked about those prescribed processes.
Yes.
If you have a factory and it's operating near people's homes,
Exactly.
then that would fall under the EPA because you want to control the emissions and you want to control the impact from the get-go.
Yeah, exactly. That's a great way to put it. So it's kind of like getting planning permission right before you build an extension on your house. You have to demonstrate that you're not going to have a negative impact on your neighbors or the environment. And if somebody does violate the EPA, then the authorities have quite a lot of power, actually.
Oh, really?
Yeah, they can issue warnings, they can demand that people make changes, they can impose fines, and in some extreme cases, they can even just completely shut down operations if it's really serious pollution.
Wow. So it's no messing around.
No.
Yeah. Okay, so we've got this EPA, which is about preventing harm, and then we've got the Noise Act, which is, well, the name kind of gives it away. It's about noise. So what would make that a better option to use in a particular instance?
Yeah, so the Noise Act really comes into play when you're dealing with noise that's considered unreasonable.
Okay.
So think about it like this. You've got a factory that's operating within its permitted hours, so it might be noisy, but it's not necessarily unreasonable because it's operating legally. But let's say that same factory starts doing extra shifts, maybe late at night, and they haven't gotten the right authorization for that.
Okay.
Then suddenly that noise does become unreasonable, and that's when you might be thinking about the Noise Act.
Okay, so to sum up, EPA is about preventing that harm in the first place from these prescribed processes that we talked about.
Yeah.
And then the Noise Act is more about responding to these specific instances of noise, which might not necessarily fall under, those bigger concerns.
That's a really great summary.
Okay.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. And this difference actually becomes really clear when you start looking at some real-world examples. So imagine that you're a council enforcement officer and you get a call about a neighbor having a massive party. The music's blasting. It's 3 o'clock in the morning.
Oh, the classic noisy neighbor.
Classic noisy neighbor, exactly.
Yeah.
So in that case, the Noise Act would probably be a much better choice than the EPA, wouldn't it?
Yeah. I mean, it's not an ongoing issue, right? It's a one-off event. It's clearly causing a disturbance. It wouldn't really fall under those preventative measures of the EPA, would it?
No, not at all. You're exactly right. It's not a prescribed process or anything like that. It's a very specific instance of noise that needs to be dealt with right there and then.
Right. So what would a council officer do in that situation? Would they just go there and tell them to turn the music down, or is there more to it?
It's a bit more complicated than that, I would say.
Okay.
So, they would probably start by gathering evidence. So they might talk to other neighbors, maybe see how many people are affected. They might even go and visit the property themselves and sort of assess how loud the noise actually is.
Okay.
And then they might issue a warning. Or if it's really bad, they might issue something called a noise abatement notice.
Okay, so there's a process.
There's a process, yeah.
It's not just an instant shutdown or anything like that.
All right, exactly.
Okay, that makes sense. What about something like a I don't know, a dog barking all the time. Would that fall under the Noise Act as well?
Yeah, definitely. So again, it's unlikely that a barking dog would be part of a prescribed process or anything like that.
Right.
But it could definitely be considered unreasonable noise, especially if it's happening constantly and at all sorts of odd hours.
Okay.
So again, the Noise Act would probably be the most appropriate legislation to use in that situation.
So for those like in the moment noise disturbances, like a party or a dog barking, construction work happening at odd hours, that's where the Noise Act kind of takes center stage, it sounds like.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. The key takeaway really is that the Noise Act is about tackling noise, which is unreasonable in a particular context. And we'll get into this more later. But
Yeah.
what's unreasonable can actually be a bit subjective. So what one person finds unbearable, another person might not even notice.
Okay, so we're starting to get into some of the trickier bits now.
Yeah, we're getting into the gray areas.
But are there any situations where both the Noise Act and the EPA might be relevant?
That's a really good question. And yeah, sometimes there can be a little bit of overlap.
Oh,
So, for example, let's say you've got a factory that's operating within its permitted hours. So it's technically following the rules of the EPA,
yeah.
but the noise is still causing a significant disturbance to the people living nearby. So in that case, you might have elements of both the EPA and the Noise Act that need to be considered.
Okay, that's interesting. So it might be following the rules, but it's still considered unreasonable.
Exactly. That's exactly right. And that's why understanding these nuances of both acts is so important for council enforcement officers.
Yeah.
They need to be able to assess each situation really carefully and figure out what the best course of action is.
All right, so it's not always black and white.
Not always, no.
And sometimes there's a bit of legal maneuvering involved to figure out the right way to solve the problem.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, this is super interesting stuff. I'm learning a lot, and we're actually just scratching the surface here.
Yeah.
So for our listeners, we're going to be going deeper into these gray areas. We're going to be talking about how the Noise Act and the EPA can work together, and sometimes even clash when you're dealing with these complex noise complaints. So stick around. We'll be right back.
Looking forward to it.
Welcome back to the Deep Dive, everybody.
Here we are.
We're talking about noise complaints in the UK, and as we were saying before the break, sometimes it's not so clear which piece of legislation is the right one to use.
Definitely not.
So let's dig into some of the specifics of the Noise Act. When would that be the better choice for a council enforcement officer? What are some of the examples?
So imagine this. It's like a beautiful Sunday afternoon. You're in your garden, just trying to relax, and suddenly your peace is shattered by the sound of construction work next door.
Ah,
Hammering, drilling, sawing, the whole works.
yeah, I can hear it now.
Right.
Yeah.
So wouldn't that fall under the EPA? We were talking about prescribed processes earlier.
Right, yeah.
So wouldn't that be covered by that?
I would think so.
You would think so, but there's a little bit of a catch here.
Sure.
So construction activities, they often have very specific time restrictions.
Oh, okay.
Right? So what might be perfectly acceptable during the week, Monday to Friday during working hours,
Yeah.
it might be totally off limits on a Sunday afternoon when everybody's trying to relax.
Right.
So in that case, even though the construction work itself might be legal if it was happening at a different time,
Right.
because it's happening on a Sunday afternoon and it's disrupting people,
Yeah.
it's actually crossing the line into what's considered unreasonable noise under the Noise Act.
So it's not just about the type of noise, it's about the timing and I guess the context, right?
Absolutely. The context is everything.
Okay, so we've talked about factories, but what about other types of businesses? Like, let's say, a pub that's causing a noise problem.
Yeah, pubs are a great example, actually, because they often kind of walk that line between what's considered acceptable and what's considered a nuisance. So let's imagine a pub is having, I don't know, live music,
Okay.
and it's really, really loud,
Okay.
and it's late at night, and the sound is spilling out into the street and disturbing the neighbors.
Right, lots of noise complaints coming in.
Lots of complaints,
Yeah,
yeah.
would that fall under the EPA?
It's tricky because, the pub itself might not be considered a prescribed process in the same way that a factory would be.
Right.
But the noise from the live music could definitely be considered unreasonable
Right.
under the Noise Act, especially if it's happening really late at night
Okay.
or exceeding certain noise levels.
So it's not just about someone having a party in their home. It could be a business as well.
Exactly, yeah. So again, it comes down to whether that noise is unreasonable in the circumstances.
Okay, that makes sense. But how do they actually decide what is unreasonable? I mean, is there like a decibel level, a magic number that triggers action?
That's a great question, and it actually gets to the heart of one of the most interesting and I think sometimes controversial aspects of the Noise Act. Okay.
So the legislation itself doesn't actually give you specific noise levels. It
Oh,
doesn't say, right, if the noise is above this many decibels, then it's unreasonable.
right.
Instead, it relies on this idea of what's considered reasonable in a given situation.
Oh, okay, so it's a bit subjective then.
It can be a bit subjective, yeah,
Okay.
because what one person might find absolutely unbearable, another person might barely notice.
Yeah, that's true.
So the role of the council enforcement officer is actually really crucial here.
Right.
They have to take all sorts of things into account. What time of day is it? What type of noise is it? How long is it going on for? How often is it happening? Where is it happening? And even things like the sensitivities of the people who are being affected by it.
So they have to gather all this information and then make a judgment call based on everything.
Exactly.
Okay, that sounds really tricky.
It can be. It's like being a detective
Yeah.
and a mediator all at once.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. You're gathering evidence, you're talking to people, you're trying to understand the whole picture.
Okay.
Then you're making a decision based on all of that information.
So that's why the Noise Act can be so effective,
Yeah.
because it's very flexible.
Exactly. It allows for that nuanced approach.
Right.
You know, you're not just looking at a number on a machine, you're actually considering all of the factors that are involved.
Right. It's not just about saying this is too loud, stop it. It's about trying to find a solution that works for everyone.
Exactly.
Okay. That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
But I can imagine that there are some situations where that could be really difficult. What if you've got multiple people contributing to the noise?
Yeah, that's a great question. So let's say you've got a block of flats, right?
Okay.
And you've got maybe several residents who are all having parties late at night,
Okay.
or playing loud music,
Yeah.
or running noisy appliances at all hours.
Right?
It can be really hard to kind of untangle that web.
Yeah, it's like a symphony of noise, but without a conductor.
Exactly, a symphony of noise. And in these cases, the Noise Act actually allows enforcement officers to issue abatement notices
Okay.
to multiple individuals,
Oh.
or even to the building management if it seems like it's a persistent problem.
So it recognizes that it might not just be one person's fault?
Exactly. Noise pollution can be a collective issue.
Yeah.
And sometimes you need a collective solution.
Okay. That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Wow. So this has been a really interesting deep dive into the Noise Act.
I'm glad you think so.
I feel like I've learned a lot about, how it works in the real world and how council enforcement officers actually use it to tackle these issues.
Yeah, and I hope our listeners have a better idea now of when and how it comes into play.
Yeah, because as we've learned, it's not just about decibel levels or hard and fast rules. It's about finding that balance, right?
Absolutely. It's about making sure that people can live their lives and businesses can operate, but also making sure that people aren't being subjected to excessive or disruptive noise.
Right, because a little bit of noise is part of life,
It is, yeah, absolutely.
but too much can be a real problem.
Exactly.
So next time you hear something that sounds like it might be breaking the rules, you'll know that the Noise Act might be on the case.
It might be.
Thanks for joining us, everybody.
Thanks for listening.
Until next time, keep those ears open.
But not too open if your neighbors are having a party.
All right, welcome back.
We're back.
We're in the final part now of our deep dive all about the Noise Act in the UK.
Yes, we are.
And as we were saying before, it can be really hard to decide, like, what is and isn't unreasonable when it comes to noise,
Absolutely, yeah.
especially when you've got, like, different people
Yeah.
all living near each other
Yeah.
with different tolerances and different sensitivities to noise.
And it's like one person's music is another person's noise.
Yeah, exactly.
What might be just a mild annoyance to one person could be like a huge disruption to somebody else.
Right, and I imagine that makes the job of, like, a council enforcement officer really tricky.
Oh, definitely.
So how do they actually sort through all those different viewpoints and decide when something really needs to be done?
Well, I mean, first and foremost, they have to actually gather evidence, right?
Right.
So this might involve speaking to the person who's made the complaint,
Yeah.
maybe even visiting the site themselves to assess the noise levels,
Okay.
maybe using recording equipment to document the noise.
So it's not just taking someone's word for it.
No.
You have to actually prove that there's a problem.
You need the evidence, yeah. And then once the enforcement officer has that evidence,
Yeah.
they have to weigh it all up, right? So
Yeah.
they have to think about, okay, what time of day is it?
Yeah.
What type of noise is it? How long does it go on for?
Yeah.
How often is it happening? Where is it happening? And like we said, they need to think about any particular sensitivities of the people who are being affected.
It's almost like they're putting a puzzle together.
It is, yeah.
Trying to figure out, is this noise really exceeding what we would consider reasonable in this specific situation?
Yeah, that's a great way to put it, like a puzzle.
And I guess the Noise Act isn't saying that there should be absolute silence everywhere.
No, of course not.
Because, I mean, that's just not realistic.
Exactly. Especially in urban areas, there's always going to be some level of noise.
Right. People have to live their lives.
People have to...
Businesses have to operate.
Businesses have to operate, exactly.
So it's about finding that balance?
It's all about balance. It's
Well, yeah.
allowing people to do their thing.
Yeah.
But also making sure that people aren't being subjected to, like, excessive or disruptive noise.
So it's about finding solutions, not just shutting things down.
Exactly. Finding solutions, yeah.
What about when you've got, like, multiple people all contributing to the problem?
That's when it gets really tricky.
Right. Because who do you blame?
Yeah, exactly.
Like, how do you untangle that mess?
So imagine, that block of flats.
Yeah.
And you've got a few residents. Yeah.
And maybe they're all having parties late at night.
Okay.
Or they're all playing loud music.
Yeah.
Or running noisy appliances, washing machines and stuff.
Right. It's just like a constant noise from everywhere.
Exactly.
You don't even know where to start.
It's a free-for-all.
Yeah.
Well, in those cases, the Noise Act actually allows enforcement officers to issue what are called abatement notices
Okay.
to multiple people.
Right.
Or even to the building management if it's like a persistent problem.
So it's recognizing that sometimes noise pollution is like a group effort.
Exactly. It's a team effort.
Yeah.
And it needs a team solution.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Well, this has been a really fascinating deep dive, I have to say.
Yeah, it's been good.
We've learned so much about the Noise Act, how it works, when it's the best tool to use, how these council enforcement officers are using it to tackle those really difficult noise problems.
And hopefully our listeners feel a bit more empowered now.
If they find themselves in a situation where they're having a problem with noise.
Yeah, they'll know what their rights are.
Exactly.
Because like we've said, it's not just about those decibel levels. It's not about these hard and fast rules.
No.
It's really about finding that balance.
It is.
Between letting people live their lives,
Yeah.
but also making sure that nobody's being subjected to, too much noise.
Absolutely.
Well, thanks for joining us for another deep dive.
It's been fun.
Until next time, stay quiet out there.
Unless you're having a party, then...
And make as much noise as you want.
Yeah, have fun.